on BBC Two.
It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The Chinese Communist Party is seeking to influence activities in the United Kingdom in ways that are frankly unacceptable.
Of course, we are concerned about the challenge that China poses. Our approach is one of engagement.
After an alleged spy scandal, does the government need to change its approach to China? Also today, Boris Johnson accuses Keir Starmer of barefaced lies over plans to renegotiate his Brexit deal. The Energy Secretary wants more onshore wind farms. What will that mean for local communities?
The government is saying something important, which is we need to build this clean energy infrastructure.
And this Czech billionaire is taking over Royal Mail. Does that matter? Joining me, Labour MP Polly Billington, Conservative MP Harriet Cross, Alva Ray from Bloomberg and political commentator Tim Montgomery. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the BBC headline about the Royal Mail takeover by the Czech billionaire. It's been approved, and you heard from Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, saying that it will be a good deal. The government will retain a so-called golden share that will require it to approve any major changes to Royal Mail's ownership, headquarter location and tax residency. The opening question to the panel, starting with Polly. Does it matter who owns this national institution?
Well, I'm pleased that we've got that agreement, which includes those protections, because I think that is vital. I mean, obviously, it is a public good and it is something that everybody needs. And the other thing that's important to include is the universal service obligation, which includes parcels. That does mean that people can rely on the service, and I think that's one of the things that the workers as well as the customers can be confident that this deal will be good for everybody.
Do you agree? Does it matter who owns this national institution?
I think it's not necessarily important who owns it. It's more important about the service is working for the customers, but also the workers at Royal Mail. As Polly said, the universal service obligation is really important, especially for more rural areas, because they'd be the ones that would be facing the cuts more if that were to change. So the assurance of that and more assurances, which I believe will be set out in the statement later today or this week, will be important as well to make sure that we have the bones of the deal. But in principle, no, it's safe. It's good for Royal Mail, it's good for the customers, and then in principle, it's fine.
Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, talked about the long-term future. I think the brand name, Royal Mail headquarters, etc., that's only guaranteed for the next 5 years. Is that long-term?
But after that, we've got the golden share, so that's effectively a veto on any of those changes.
The former business secretary, Liberal Democrat Vince Cable, says it is sensible to be concerned about the ownership. Daniel Kretinsky. The debt-fuelled offer, he said, in his Russian connection should give ministers pause for thought.
Well, of course, it was the Liberal Democrats with the Conservatives who privatised Royal Mail in the first place. So it actually means, and then Labour is sort of continuing with that, is not going to bring it back into public ownership. So really no politicians are in a position to be criticising this. It does seem on the face of it like this Czech billionaire is going to give Royal Mail the cash injection that it needs. There are all these protections, and he's making the case that Royal Mail now has to compete with places like Amazon and DPD, and without that investment it just wouldn't happen. So on the face of it, it looks okay. I mean, Vince Cable, I don't know. He's gone a little bit off the rails with some of his comments on foreign policy lately, and so I don't think he necessarily speaks... Especially on China.
And we're
so I
going to
don't
come and
think
talk
he
about that in
necessarily
just a
speaks for the Liberal Democrats on that.
Do you want to join your fellow panellists in welcoming this deal and comment on whether it matters who owns a sort of British, a national institution?
I agree with everything I think the panellists have said. I think a good deal has been negotiated in protecting the customer, at least over the medium term. And I don't object to this individual deal. I do worry, though, Joe, overall, I think there is a short-termism in our country, and I think it's more of a cultural thing rather than a legal or a political thing. But we are very good and fast at selling off national assets to people abroad who perhaps are taking a longer-term view than our own investors and our own government. And I think we are, as an economy, very dependent upon selling assets to balance the fact that we aren't producing enough goods. And so I think this deal is perhaps fine and defensible, But we do need to start asking ourselves some pretty long and hard questions about whether we need to invest in our manufacturing base in a much more significant way, because we are very much vulnerable to international market sentiment, and that is not a good place for an economy to be.
Polly?
I'm looking forward to Tim's support, therefore, of our industrial strategy and indeed our clean energy plan, which is absolutely vital for us to be able to develop those supply chains, get those manufacturing jobs in, and make sure that we've got that kind of long-term view about our economy. Because for far too long, I agree with you, Tim, we have been far too short term and looking only at how we can get money in the short term rather than thinking about the long term and what that means for our overall rebalancing of our economy. Particularly as well about the regional inequalities around that.
100%.
And I think we can work much harder at that. But I'm looking forward to your supporting our industrial strategy, our regional growth plan.
You'll be reminded of that.
Of the National Planning Policy Framework to get all of this done.
Well, the one problem I have with the Labour approach, and I have a lot of sympathy, actually, a lot of sympathy with what you're trying to do, and you're trying to restore an industrial strategy that Greg Clark, the former industry minister, had, which the Tories abandoned, and that was a mistake. The problem, I think, with Labour is not enough private sector involvement in some of your decisions, like the recent carbon capture investment in Britain. So, actually, I think
private
there's a lot
will definitely be stepping up.
I think there's a lot of overlap,
and we're going to come on to that a little bit.
That reason.
Well, we'll come on to that a little bit later on in the programme. But let's have a look at this headline, this story that has emerged over the weekend. China spy efforts happening in plain view, says ex-Tory leader, the ex-Tory leader being Ian Duncan Smith. And a number of MPs, including him, have raised concerns about security implications following the news of an alleged Chinese spy who has been kicked out of the country on national security grounds, but it's been revealed had close links to the Duke of York. Let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. What's the latest on this, Henry?
Well, Joe, I think we still don't know whether in the coming days we might actually be able to name this alleged Chinese spy, who is currently known, as they're known in court documents, by the term H6. There is a possibility, but we still don't know whether this will take place, of what's known as an urgent question in Parliament today. That might be an opportunity for an MP to use parliamentary privilege to name the alleged spy in the House of Commons chamber. But actually, I think if you set aside the questions of anonymity, I think what we're increasingly going to get here is questions about what this says for how the government should or should not deal with China, because one of the striking things that has happened under this new government is that it has pursued warmer relations with China. They would say that they're merely being pragmatic, but nevertheless, last month, Keir Starmer became the first Prime Minister in 6 years to meet Xi Jinping, China's leader. He's meant to be going to China for a visit next year, the first since Theresa May in 2018. And in that context, we now have these allegations about a Chinese spy operating at the heart of the British establishment.
Yes, I mean, Henry, Keir Starmer was asked about it at a press conference in Norway where he is visiting today. How difficult is it going to make what the government would say is a balance between a pragmatic approach towards China, and they want to boost economic growth, as you said, and these sorts of security issues?
Look, I think the government would say that that was a balance that they were trying to strike in any case before this was publicly disclosed. And of course, you know, these proceedings to do with the alleged spy we're calling H6, you know, they began when the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, barred him from entry to the UK last year. So the government will have been aware of this, even the new ministers, for some time. But they would say, look, it's a balance that they're trying to strike the whole time in their dealings with China. The economic reality that it is an economic behemoth and an important trading partner,
yes,
and the diplomatic complications that may separately be present in dealing with what is, after all, another permanent member of the UN Security Council.
Henry Zeffman, thank you. Polly, are closer ties with China a mistake?
No, I don't think they are. And I wouldn't necessarily call it closer ties with China.
What would you call it?
It's about cooperation, it's about competition, it's about challenge.
Although Keir Starmer has advocated.
Well, I think, but
closer.
when we're talking about cooperation on the big global challenges, like, for example, climate change, competing, because we want to be able to compete with big global powers like them in terms of economic competitiveness, and challenge where we need to. You can only challenge if you're engaging. If you turn your back on a big global global power like China, you lose influence rather than increase it.
I mean, Tim, what is the problem? We can see pictures here, as Henry Zeffman said, first time British Prime Minister has met with Xi Jinping in quite some time. They're meeting here at the G20. Is there a problem?
Well, look, one of Keir Starmer's predecessors, Margaret Thatcher, signed a deal with signed a deal with China over Hong Kong. Nearly all of the key protections of liberty of the Hong Kong people that were in that agreement have been ripped up by the Chinese government well before the deadline of that deal expired. There are British citizens in prison in China illegally, and China are doing nothing about them. So I think what China have done, they've treated us really badly. They're spying on our industry. They're stealing our intellectual copyright. And what does Keir Starmer do? He goes and meets them after, quite rightly, the last Conservative government had put China into the deep freeze. China will look at us now and think that we're a weak nation who will capitulate to them if we want commercial relations. And I think it's very sad. And I'm not even sure that Keir Starmer adequately raised the persecution of the Uyghurs in China at the moment is one of the most disgraceful things happening in the world in human rights at all. The fact that we are sitting down with China and not raising these issues in substantial ways, well, I'm afraid I think it's not your view, Polly. I bet you secretly do not like this, but actually I think, because I know who you are. And
you can reveal all, Polly. You can reveal all.
You're someone with a track record of caring about these issues, and I think it's embarrassing that our Prime Minister isn't raising.
We
these
have
issues.
raised Jimmy Lai, for example, and the issues to do with Hong Kong and indeed the Uyghurs. These things are important. We do need to be engaging. If you simply turn your back, you don't actually increase your influence at all. And I think that's where you've got to be a grown-up when it comes to diplomacy if you want to be a global power.
I just think it's so important that Tim raised this about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the way China is treating them, because I actually do think that Labour doesn't have a joined-up policy on China. This covers so many different areas. It's foreign policy, but it's also industrial policy. It's economic policy. I mean, there's so many examples. For example, Shein, the Chinese fast fashion company, Bloomberg found a couple of years ago that the cotton in their clothes could be traced back to Xinjiang, that area that uses Uyghur slave labour. Shein now wants to list on the London Stock Exchange. Labour is not blocking that. I'm told that they've been holding a sort of charm offensive to encourage this listing because the City of London is struggling for money. There are things like that. Labour, it's not just sort of about, cooperation and challenge. Labour is not, really challenging that at all. And you have this absurd situation where Angela Rayner is bringing in increased workers' protections with her employment rights bill here, while also encouraging this in other parts of the world. But that's just one tiny example. I mean, there are electric vehicles, solar panels, computer chips. There's just whole areas of policy where, honestly, as a journalist, sort of speaking to different people in government, I just don't see a joined-up plan.
Polly?
Well, I would say, for example, Sarah Champion, who is the chair of the International Development Select Committee, has already been raising the issues to do with supply chains, both in the Clean Power Plan and other parts of our economy. Because if we want to be a global leader in good standards, we need to be able to do that. So I will be backing what she does on those aspects.
I mean, the Conservative Party, under David Cameron's leadership, certainly hugged China far closer than in recent years. I mean, we can see David Cameron, intriguingly, taking Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, to a pub in his then constituency.
That policy was abandoned, to be fair, though.
Yes, it was,
recently.
but it was a policy during the years 2010, certainly to 2015, that golden era. Do you think that was regrettable, Harriet?
I think certainly, as Tim's pointed out, that's not the policy as was sort of at the beginning of this year, or certainly through the latter half of the Conservatives' time in government. We need to be very vigilant and very careful when dealing with China. As Polly said, it's very important to be able to have dialogue, and as far as then you might be able to change their minds. But I think more of the issue is the more you engage, the more legitimacy you give China, and the more legitimacy you give sort of what they're doing, either in the foreground or stuff that's going on in the background. I do do not want to be in a country that's reliant on China, either explicitly or in terms of sort of what they might be doing, sort of pulling strings in the back. It's a very difficult and dangerous situation to get in when we are reliant on a state which treats its people the way it does, treats the rest of the world the way it does, and doesn't seem to care about being caught in doing so.
So what action would you propose? We saw Tom Tugendhat in the headlines advocating clearly a much sort of more stringent policy with China. But what does that mean in practice?
It's multi-layered. It has to be. Obviously, you need to look at what China's ambitions are. Their ambitions are to be the global superpower. So how do you interrupt that? Do you come in insofar as trade? Do you come in insofar as diplomacy? There is 101 different ways in which you can get under the skin of China. It won't be one thing. It'll be many things at the same time.
Can the UK afford to do that? What, put China out in the cold?
It's actually a little bit of the conversation I had with Polly a little bit earlier about industrial capacity. You know, we can't ignore the fact that China is a massive manufacturing power. But during the pandemic, we were dependent upon China for key imports of medical materials. I think one idea that Dominic Raab, the former Foreign Secretary, had, which was incredible, was a League of Democracies. And I think one thing that League of Democracies could be doing is we should be identifying key manufacturing products, military obviously, medical, perhaps others, where actually the trade is largely between democracies, so that we are not dependent upon tyrannical regimes, whether it's China or Russia or certain countries in the Middle East. Yes, trade with them because there's certain things we have to trade with them, and poorer people in this country would be disadvantaged if we didn't, in particular. But actually, I think there are certain levels of industry where an alliance of democracies should be setting out a different kind of economic strategy.
Polly?
Look, I think if we're going to be an open and global power which leads with our values as well as being able to increase our economic growth here, then we need to be connecting on the basis of those values as well as on our advantages. So, of course, like I say, I don't think it's sensible for us to turn our backs on a big global power like China, but we do also need to recognise who our friends are. And of course, I would include in that, and I'm sure we'll come on to it later on, our European neighbours.
Oh, well, that leads us into the headline here in the iPaper. EU tells Starmer, your Brexit reset is doomed without a better offer on fish and under 30s. Should those concessions be considered?
Well, look, all of this is about negotiation. And I think that's what's quite interesting is everybody wants to kind of negotiate on the telly. You can't negotiate on the telly. You've got to negotiate in the room. And I think we've got to be quite clear about what our red lines are, which is no customs union, no movement, no free movement. And no single market, and then work on what we can achieve, because we know that the deal that we were left with is unsatisfactory. I can see the impact in East Thanet, right? We have a port that doesn't work. We've got English language schools that are really struggling. There are things that we can do, and the small businesses that would like to export to our nearest neighbours. You can see France from Ramsgate in my constituency. It's closer to France than it is to London, and yet we are suffering from those barriers. So we need to be thinking about a big reset.
Right, and this is the deal that was negotiated by the former Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and it will be looked at again and opened next year. Do you think these things should be on the table in that negotiation?
I think we need to fear anything that's on the table when it's Keir Starmer and the Labour Party negotiating it, because as we've seen so far this year, they always go into a negotiation and come out with nothing. So they gave the Chagos Islands away with nothing in return. They had deals.
Harry, you know that was being prepared under the
yes, and there was
former Tory government.
And there was a reason, Polly, but it was not. They didn't go through because we didn't finalise the discussions because we couldn't get to a negotiated situation. So Labour just agreed and moved on, as they do. They put it in a box. Same as paid deals with trade unions. The train drivers just put it in a box. That's done. Nothing in return. We need to be careful, and we know from the past, Keir Starmer is very keen on free movement. He campaigned for this continually after the Brexit vote. Same as second referendum. His heart is not in Brexit. Wherever anyone.
Is your heart in Brexit?
We voted for Brexit. The country voted for Brexit. It has to be delivered.
And the country also voted for a Labour government which said that we're going to have no free movement, no single market, and no customs union.
So that would be the basis. They also said that they would not cut APR on farmers. They also said that they they would have a £28 billion green investment deal, which they then cut before the election. They also didn't say that they were going to put £40 billion of taxes on in their first budget. So I don't think we can actually take what Labour said
because of the mess you left us in, and that's why we've had to deal with those things.
Can you be trusted, Keir Starmer, to stick to those red lines that you have set out when, well, Boris Johnson has written this, perhaps unsurprisingly, but I call on everyone who cares about democracy and the economic salvation of this country to fight, fight, fight again for the freedoms the people voted for in 2016 and which they believed were secure. What would you say to Boris Johnson?
Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I mean, it's clearly a bad deal, and which is one of the reasons why we're having to renegotiate it.
Right. I mean, was it a bad deal? Shouldn't it be renegotiated?
Well, I actually think I've had my differences with Boris Johnson, but he's absolutely right about the key thing here is the democratic accountability. Harriet's exactly right about the fact that Labour have broken many promises since the election, and I don't think they're as useless for why they've broken them stand up to much scrutiny. And so it was, we all remember that period. It was one of the most tumultuous in our nation's recent history. We went through so much pain, and Brexit, you know, get Brexit done wasn't just like a statement of an objective, it was a frustration with the paralysis. I think Labour reopening all of this after they said they wouldn't reopen it, that was what they said in the manifesto, I think is a very dangerous thing for trust in democracy. And from my new party's point of view, Reform, it'll suit us very well if Labour break their promises on Europe.
Labour did say they wanted
it would be bad for the country.
They wanted closer relationships, and they did want to look at the deal because they said it was a bad deal. I mean, you must accept some aspects of the deal for your constituents. It's been widely reported the fishing industry is critical of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is also part of this.
Absolutely, and that's now for renegotiation, as was always the case. It was always meant to run out in 2026, and the renegotiation is starting for that next year. And I can tell you for a fact, the fishermen in my part of the country are very worried about what Labour might do with fishing because they see it as an easy thing that will be traded away in favour of something else. So, yes, I completely agree that fishermen did not get the deal that they wanted out of the last Brexit negotiations, but they are in no way
So why would they listen
naive.
to the Conservatives about anything to do with a better deal or not?
Because they've seen, so there is a slightly different agreement as well in Scotland versus in England with fishing, and there's issues insofar as equalising these up and actually seeing what's being given away in terms of Scottish fishing would not be actually be seen as given away in English fishing. It's slightly more complicated, but it's not the fact that the deal that they have at the moment is perfect. It's more of an issue of where we might go from here. And it's seen as an easy thing to give away because it's something that the Europeans really want because it is a very big card that we have. And our fishermen are very worried about where we might get to.
What would you give the EU? They'll want something for closer trading cooperation.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be dealt with by people who know more about the intricacies of EU trade than I do.
Well, it does sound like the direction of travel or the asks from the EU are around sort of youth mobility, and you know. My colleagues have been reporting on sort of an initial look in government at sort of like allowing more school trips from European countries in and sort of ending the red tape on that. Maybe something around students, which would be similar, or for under 30s. Those seem to be key things that the EU wants. Whether the UK actually gives them that is a different question. But I actually think that what Boris Johnson was getting at, and the thing that actually we don't need to wait for a renegotiation on, that we really should talk about is the legislation that Labour is currently bringing in, where essentially we'll become rule takers. I don't mean that in a political way, but we will factually just become rule takers from the EU under Labour's legislation, which is going to align our rules on things like food with the EU to make trade easier. Boris Johnson attacking that, Lord Frost attacking that. That's like the reality of what is happening. And I mean, I don't think people are really talking about the trade-offs there. I mean, ultimately, it was a very difficult situation to have food in the UK subject to different rules to the rest of the EU, bad for people on both sides of that equation. But because we're not in the EU, we don't have a say in those rules anymore. So the only way to make that easier is to just take them from the EU. I don't think that breaks Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. I would be surprised, really, if the Brexit deal changed that much, given these red lines. It's just the fact that we've left, and all it means is that now we're outside saying, yeah, we still want to be close to you, so we'll take your rules, but we don't have any say in them.
But that was the consequence of the deal that was negotiated, that if the EU changes rules, then we have to align with them, and businesses will want that.
Well, I think there is one difference. I agree, actually, largely what Alva's just said on that. I think where the Brexit opportunity, I think, always is not so much in the existing industries, it's in new industries. So even Peter Mandelson, Lord High Priest of EU relations, was recently telling the Times, he thought it was very useful that on issues like AI, we weren't going to be subject to EU regulation because they're regulating the sector incredibly hard, and Britain has an opportunity in a new industry to go in a different direction. I think with the existing industries, because we're already largely aligned, I think there is a lot of sense in the proposals that are being made. But what is my greater sort of frustration about it is that we're not taking advantage of those freedoms that we do have. And also, frankly, I don't really trust Keir Starmer. He's a EU file to his fingertips, and I'm worried that he will give away. It's striking that Polly didn't know what our negotiating position was, and she's a supporter of the government. I think Keir Starmer could easily give away things too eagerly, given his commitment to the EU, and that's what I worry about.
Polly?
No, I mean, I think what's interesting is you're saying of the old industries, we just need to keep aligned. Those are absolutely things like food and farming and fish, so which are really key exports for us. So actually being aligned is very important, and we are ending up having to be rule takers because of the nature of the deal that was done.
Well, I'm agreeing with you on that. I think the difference
I just think those old industries actually deserve to have somebody who's going to speak up for them, and I don't obviously share your scepticism about our ability to be able to defend them.
And one other thing we also should think about is what we may want may not be what the EU want at all. The very thought of
negotiations are about.
The very thought of extending negotiations probably fills our European friends with horror, because you look at the French government. Well, they don't have a government really in France at the moment. Germany's got an imminent election. Whether they're going to spend much time wanting to renegotiate with Britain, I think we need to get on with the job of being yesterday, I think, was the first day we joined the new sort of Pacific trade alliance.
Yes, it was.
These are the sort of upsides of the Brexit agreement that perhaps we need to focus a little bit more on.
I mean, you quit the Conservatives before over Brexit. You've now left the party for a second time to join Reform UK. Why?
Well, I think it was on this programme during the general election, Joe, you noted that you got out of me that I would have voted Nigel Farage at the last election. This has been a journey that I've been on for a little while. But for me, one of the fundamental issues in this country at the moment is that the British people have repeatedly voted for the control of immigration. And repeatedly, I'm afraid the party that I was until recently a member of failed to deliver it. And even with legal migration, which they could have controlled, they weren't controlling it. We had, how many times on your programme were we discussing the Rwanda scheme? It was almost irrelevant.
I lost count.
to the challenge of legal migration. And that deceit by the Conservative Party to have won Brexit, we're just talking about Brexit. Brexit probably wouldn't have happened without the promise and the debate about migration. I don't think the 2019 general election victory that Boris Johnson enjoyed wouldn't have happened without the promise to control it. And the fact that they failed to deliver so comprehensively was the last straw for me.
Harriet?
I haven't yet heard how Reform plan to tackle migration in a way that's actually going to be meaningful and practical. It's very easy to shout from the sidelines. It's very easy when you're a smaller party to say, oh, we will do this and we will do that and it will make it all better. But I haven't actually seen anything which would practically and make a difference. Migration is an issue all around the world. We've seen that all around the world, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in America, whether it's here in the UK. It's a global issue. It's very difficult, incredibly difficult, and Tim, you recognise that. It's very difficult. No, the Conservative Party haven't got everything right, but we tried to get things right. We tried to make changes, and changes have been made. For example, we saw changes that were brought in last year on things like minimum wage and student visas and family relations, things like that. It's difficult. Government is difficult. Reform obviously haven't been in government, so they're not willing to accept.
Harriet, just saying it's difficult really isn't good enough. The fact was
what would Reform do?
The immigration under the Conservatives was higher than under the Blair years. So the Tories came to power.
And what was immigration around the world under the Conservatives, like when Conservatives were in power versus when Blair was in power?
It was higher.
So why would that not impact here?
No, I'm saying immigration into Britain during the Conservative years was higher under the Blair years.
Yes,
Conservative promised to control.
As was global migration. Migration numbers across the globe increased.
So you're just blaming that it was a world problem?
No, I'm not. I'm not just blaming. I'm saying it's very easy to look at a figure and point a figure rather than looking at the
Tim respond
picture.
in terms of what reform would actually offer to deal with this. Why have you put your faith in Reform UK to solve this problem?
Well, I think anyone who looks at Nigel Farage is a Marmite character for lots of people, but anyone who does not believe that this is an issue that is absolutely his number 1, number 2 and number 3 priority.
Yeah, but recognising it is one thing. And how's Harriet is saying doing something.
On illegal migration, Harriet would have a point. Illegal migration is, controlling the boats that are crossing the channel is a very difficult issue to cross, and I do not have an answer for you on that. But legal migration, which is in the government's control, there are so many policy levers that can be pulled to address that problem. And the fact is, I think there is a mentality still at the heart of the Conservative Party, which is basically a Davos mentality, rather than a Brexit mentality, a mentality that's governed by the views of big business rather than the view of the individual citizen. And I think Rishi Sunak in particular was interested in a general increase in GDP, which may have looked good overall in statistics, but actually what matters is GDP per head, which is one of the good things that Labour are measuring. They're saying they should be judged on GDP per head. And it's the failure to control legal migration, which is much easier. That was the Tory failure.
But I guess the big question, Tim, is that what type of legal migration would you control and cut? Because it's easy to look at the big number and say, oh, that's too high. Yeah. But if you break it down, it's sort of, well, like Ukrainian refugees, for example, people coming from Hong Kong, you literally just mentioned Hong Kong earlier, care workers, and
there's an exemption in Reform UK's manifesto for care workers, which reached 90,000. Yeah. So that wouldn't be a zero.
Care would collapse without that. Students, basically foreign students, the money from them props up our university sector.
Our bloated, failing university sector.
And of course, Farage said in the past that he welcomed students from around the world. That would be one of the things that he wanted. That's not somewhere he'd be looking at either.
Can I just respond to the barrage of those things? Yeah. 90,000 care workers. We had 900,000 net people coming in. So the numbers are way out of control. Immigration will take a little while to come down, but it can be brought down to much more reasonable levels. And the issues that people are worrying about at the moment, take house prices, take ability to see a GP. These are all exacerbated by migration, and it's a much greater exacerbation than the benefit we have of, for example, medical personnel coming in.
But I'm just not hearing what type of legal migration you would limit. It seems like, to me...
Students, definitely, because I think people are coming in and they're staying...
Even if that hit the university sector and universities had to close?
A lot of the university sector is not a good use of economic resources. A lot of people are getting degrees from our universities which aren't really worth. They're getting into a lot of debt for them. So I will definitely close down a lot of those routes. I think we're letting too many dependents in. And also I think generally we are not... Construction, for example, we should be having a massive investment in our own workforce so that we have people who are currently on sickness benefits, 2 million people in Britain at the moment, they should be retrained to replace those workers.
With respect, I do think that actually is Labour's policy. It will just take a long time to do it. And so I actually feel, I appreciate that you've actually nailed down what you would do on students, because it always feels to me like in the abstract people say they want lower immigration but never commit to what part of that big number they would limit. But actually my understanding of Labour's policy, who knows whether it will work, is that they are investing in vocational training so that more people from the UK can do these jobs, and eventually maybe in a decade we'll see those numbers come down. But in the sort of the short term, it doesn't seem like any party can just control migration without a massive hit to the economy that really no one wants to see.
Harriet, the accusation that the Conservatives inhabit a more Davos-style mentality, what do you say to that? Tim levelled that at you.
I think Tim's going to have to explain it to me because I don't actually understand what you mean.
It is basically the Davos summit where big business meets the politicians. And the interests of big business, they can afford massive compliance departments, they can afford the massive environmental regulations that Polly favours. Small businesses and a lot of homes suffer from that sort of mentality. And I think the Tory mentality favours the big business worldview rather than the little guy who often struggles with government regulation and tax and international trade.
Harriet?
I don't think I agree. I think, so effectively what you're saying is we're in the pockets of big business. We don't necessarily want to see any regulation comes in that kind of helps the small guy.
I think that's the tendency.
I don't think... that's certainly not how I feel. I don't feel that Conservatives have being a party that necessarily overlooks small businesses, small entrepreneurs, SMEs, people who are striving and trying. I think that's very much the party who we're for. So any suggestion, and actually we had this in the Commons a few days ago, talking about energy profits levy, and the accusation was that we, the Conservatives, were only there interested in the big energy companies. We're like, well, no, we're not. We're interested in this because of the jobs it supports, because of the local economy it supports, because of all the trickle-down effects. So absolutely not. I mean, this business are vitally important. They are the catalyst to a lot of this, but they're not there on their own. There is so much underneath, whether that's direct employees, whether that's supply chains, but it's all part of the ecosystem that is the country and the economy of the country. Right. You can't see one without the other.
Is this forever, this move to Reform UK?
Well, certainly I have no time limit on it, but ultimately I do think, you know, I am a natural Conservative in so many respects, and I hope that if the choice, as we get close to the next election, is between Polly's Keir Starmer being re-elected and a Reform Conservative alliance, I hope Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch would choose some sort of alliance, because we know after 6 months how much damage this Labour government is doing to this country. What damage they could do in a second parliament would be enormous. So I would support any arrangement to keep Labour out.
Well, I think that's quite interesting, because Nigel Farage, you know, it'll be interesting to see how you find it consistent with what you believe, with what Nigel Farage has said about, for example, the NHS being shifting to a national insurance system or a social insurance system, what he thinks about overseas aid, which you actually think is a good thing in order to be able to reduce conflict.
I don't agree with Nigel on everything.
That's going. Well, if you're talking about
who does agree with people on everything,
being able to be part of a party so that you can have a platform to be able to engage with the British people, let alone set up some kind of alliance with the Tories, there's got to be some clarity about what really Reform wants to do. And when you've got a manifesto which had half a page of A4 on the NHS, bearing in mind how important that is to the British people, I don't think Reform would take it being serious about the real challenges that this country faces.
Let me concede absolutely. Reform is a very new political party, and its manifesto at the last election will not be its manifesto at the next election.
You can't govern on vibes.
No, we can't. If you let me finish. I think the task for Reform now is to build the sort of manifesto that absolutely addresses your question, and that's something I want to play a part in.
Well,
your Reform should be judged on what will be. I've been incredibly impressed with what I've seen with Reform since I joined. They've got money, they've got talent, and I think the manifesto that the Reform puts, we'll wait and see.
Well, there are just two things, though. Just to pick up on what Polly said, are you signed up to any form of social insurance scheme to fund the NHS, which is something Nigel Farage raised? Yes.
Well, I don't know what the even Reform policy will be on the National Health Service. So what I'm trying to say is that I think over the next couple of years, Reform are really determined to invest very seriously in policy research.
Although they
will be able to address the legitimate questions that Polly has raised.
Taxes,
we're not in that position
twice
now.
as big as the ones that Liz Truss made. That's the kind of thing you had in your manifesto. Well, they had a manifesto only a few months ago, and it had twice as many tax cuts as Liz Truss. That is economic chaos.
Just one final thing. This headline, rivals attack Farage for saying West provoked Ukraine war. You will remember his comments paraphrasing that if you poke the Russian bear, it will respond. You don't agree with that either, do you?
I don't agree with that. Right. We could spend probably a few minutes going through the things which I disagree with Nigel Farage on. But on the control of immigration, crime, tax, patriotism, investment in British industry, the big issues that this country faces, I'm absolutely with Reform.
All right.
And actually, most Labour voters are, most Conservative voters are. Reform talks much more common sense, I'm afraid, than the other.
But you still have 5 minutes. Let's have a look at this headline. Government unveils new powers to approve onshore wind farms. It's part of a new plan announced last Friday to give ministers the final say on approving large onshore wind farms rather than leaving decisions to local councils. Polly, if local people object to a wind farm being built in their constituency, can they stop it?
Well, they'll be able to have conversations about it, but ultimately we've got to be able to make sure that we get this energy in built, right? And what we find that onshore wind is actually pretty popular with people, particularly when we're going to be building a community benefit package to make sure that there is local benefits for hosting that infrastructure.
Right, but the answer is no. I mean, if people object, they can have conversations, but if they object, it will be enforced on them.
One of the things we're going to do is make sure that we've got a proper land use framework where you're making decisions about what land is used for. And when we've made those decisions locally, those follow through into a national plan so that we are making sure that we protect food and food production where we need to, infrastructure where we need to, nature where we need to, and housing where we need to.
Have you got a problem with any of that?
I have a problem with the strategy and the timing and how much is actually being kind of imposed on the British people and how quickly and how little say our communities are getting. As Polly said, in general, people are in favour of this. They're probably the people who don't have to see it, who aren't near it. Not the communities like mine in Gordon and Buchan and elsewhere in the country who will have these turbines onshore next to them, right in their eye line every day. We've seen, I mean, if you look at the capacity, we're talking about doubling the amount of onshore wind, tripling the amount of onshore solar. Where's that going to go? Where is it going to go other than on land that is being used either for farmland, either for, which could have been for tourism, which could have been for building, which is impacting on communities, sense of space, sense of community in the areas. The speed in which this is being brought forward and the way in which it's being completely railroaded over communities who have no say in the matter at all is unbelievably poor policy. Also really bad politics, but also it doesn't actually bring us to a solution where we need to be because everything else needs to catch up at the same time. The haste that this is being brought through and the way that there is this artificial deadline of 2030, which has been imposed, is meaning that actually decisions are being made which are poorer decisions.
Right,
so, for example,
let Polly respond.
What it will do is it sets a long-term sense of direction and certainty for investors, which I think is really important for us to be able to get this energy infrastructure built. It's not just about the onshore wind. That's part of the mix. It's a very, very wide energy mix with a lot of different kinds of clean energy sources.
Will it cost people more at the beginning?
No, it won't. And this is the important thing.
So will it cut bills?
Over time, it will cut bills.
How much?
That's one of the things. Well, I know what you're trying to do.
Well, no, I'm just trying to get you to say what we were promised in the run-up to the election.
Absolutely.
And that was done on independent modelling, and that's what we.
So that was an ESO modelling.
That was independent modelling at the time. Now, obviously, prices change, but we know that we will have lower bills as a result of this than if we had been left with the plans from before. Certainty is really important. We know that because we know that prices go down over time if you put the investment in. That's one of the things about this kind of infrastructure and in this kind of investment.
So we've seen, for example, if we increase the offshore wind, for example, or onshore wind by the amount it is, there'll be so much over capacity for our grid, but we're going to have to increase curtailment payments. So that's going to be a cost.
You don't. Because you actually change the way that the grid works and you change you reform the energy markets. Both of those things are possible, and we're doing a lot of work on that.
It's a tight deadline. One of the other things.
It might be a tight deadline, but what it does is it sends confidence to the market that this is what this country wants to do, and without it, we will end up being dependent on volatile international oil and gas prices.
If we had a 2035 deadline, 2040 deadline, that would still give confidence of what we want to do.
We'll
just be doing it in a way that's more pragmatic, brings communities along, make sure we're actually doing it in a way that doesn't sterilise land or sterilise things for the future, which actually means that we could actually progress faster.
Well, let me bring another issue to the table, because, Alva, there is a contradiction here at the heart of what Labour is saying. On the one hand, devolution. Angela Rayner is going to talk about devolution, giving more power, if not fundraising power, to mayors, for example. And yet, we are hearing, rightly or wrongly, that some things are going to be forced onto councils. Your piece here in Bloomberg, Rachel Reeves, blocks calls from English mayors for more tax powers. So talking about devolution, or is it just a reorganisation? And really, the power and the money will remain in central hands?
Well, so to be fair to Labour, even before the election, they were saying that they are really committed to devolution and they want English mayors to be much more closely involved in their growth plans for economic growth, for these planning targets and the skills agenda, so the vocational training that we were talking about earlier in the context of immigration. And they're now delivering that. Angela Rayner is delivering a big speech on that later today with a few more powers for mayors. But as you say, we have this story in Bloomberg today that Rachel Reeves has been blocking calls from these mayors for more powers to raise tax. At the moment, they're basically limited to just indirectly raising council tax, which will just sort of fall. We know how council tax feels. They want a sort of greater range of things that they could do. Things they're looking at would be a tourist tax, they call it, and a sort of conferences and events levy. Cities like Birmingham host Tory party conference, for example. They want to be able to raise tax from that. They also want to do things like taxing undeveloped land, because property developers are sometimes buying up land but not taxing it.
Basically want to tax everything.
Well, they basically, I don't think it's necessarily about increasing the overall tax revenue as just changing which levers they can pull and changing the incentives. So rather than just putting it on ordinary people with their council tax, actually saying, OK, we're going to tax this big hotel, or we're going to tax this under this sort of vacant
ordinary
property,
people end up paying all the taxes in the end. It all comes back to consumers.
Well, I think if you, for example, if you're taxing a property developer who has bought up land in the hope of, it's called land banking, like sort of buying up land when it's cheap, with aiming to develop it maybe in the future, but basically leaving it empty. If you tax that, you're kind of incentivizing them to build on it quicker, and then you avoid the tax. So they're thinking that they can kind of rejig the incentives. But basically, Rachel Reeves is just saying no. So they're going to be given these more powers to decide things, but no powers over the sort of levers they can pull, the incentives that they can say. She says that people are already paying too much tax. That's kind of after her budget. But it just sort of means that mayors, they're only really working on one side of the seesaw. And I think
Do you think that's fair, that they should have more tax-raising powers themselves if they want to deliver real devolution?
You won't be surprised to know that I agree with Rachel that people are being taxed quite enough. Thank you very much. And I certainly know that when we're looking at no, because we know that we already had
largely taxed by your government.
Because we inherited a situation where British people were paying the highest tax.
And you put it up even further.
And we've had to deal with that. So I understand about that. I have to say on the Devo thing, it might make sense to the likes of Andy Burnham and so
Manchester.
Forth in some of the big cities. But if we're looking for devolution for somewhere which we're talking about else outside of the big cities, the idea of having a tourist tax in a seaside economy like where I represent, we've got loads of things that we need to sort out before we started doing that. We need to regulate short-term holiday lets, make sure that we protect our hotels and B&Bs rather than making it harder for them. So I would be against that.
It's all we have time for today, I'm afraid. We can continue the conversation after the credits roll. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Have a great afternoon.
The knights and the bills.
The knights and the bills.
We need to work together.